I would like to introduce our presenter for this afternoon, who happens to be Dr. Dani Fontaine-Renee from the University of Cape Town. Dani is the director of the first year experience at the University of Cape Town, and she is based in the Center for Higher Education Development. She has particular disciplinary research interests in urban development, particularly how we build cities to facilitate and/or constrain children's access to daily physical activity. She also has a lot of research interest in the first year experience, especially in first generation students and their success at university, academic advising, and in academic advising, and in indicators for student success, and pedagogical interest in course design, including assessment design and universal design for learning. So she will be presenting on a very important aspect of our work, which is using data-informed decision-making, or making decisions that are based on data. So without wasting much time, let me hand over to Dani.
Thank you, Ephraim. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, colleagues. It's lovely to see some familiar names in the room. The numbers keep ticking up, so that's lovely. I do have, a webinar planned, but please, for those of you who know me, I'm very easygoing. If you have any questions at any point, I'm more than happy to take them as you have them. Otherwise, I have obviously ensured that there is time at the end for us to have some collaborative conversation. So I guess you could say my focus today, for those of you who've been with us through the week, you will have heard from colleagues of mine from other universities on some very specific initiatives that are being done at particular institutions for the first year experience, and which draws upon data and data analytics and using data to either produce programs or make some important decisions about the first year experience, if not beyond as well. My focus today is slightly different. I'm pegging this at a bigger scale. As a geographer, that's a key term we like to use. This is more going to be at a systems approach, sort of taking a much broader overview approach, and going to walk with you a journey that I find myself walking through the lens of the first year experience, in terms of how UCT is navigating its own journey to get to a point of more and better informed decision making by virtue of the kinds of data we collect, the data analytics we run, and the changes we make based on what the data is telling us. So that's the journey I'm going to walk with you today. And keep in mind, sort of the underlying mandate through all of this is student success, because ultimately that's what we're here for, right? We want to ensure that our students are successful. And of course, that's a big term. It can mean many things to different people. It can be measured in many different ways, but all in due course. So the first thing I'd like for us to do is the very first thing I've put in the chat is a link to a Jamboard. And so I'd like us all just collaboratively to think and to share some ideas, just to get the creative juices going, if you will. What are examples of measures of student success? Just honestly, anything that comes to mind. If you had to answer that question for someone, what are measures of student success? I'm not asking you to define a measure or define student success. I'm simply asking you to please give examples of what you would term as measures of student success. Sorry, my computer is telling me it has a low battery. So I've allocated pages 1 through 3 of the Jamboard for you to contribute on. So please take a couple of minutes just to put down your thoughts, and I will call up the Jamboard so that we can see in real time how it is being populated.
Dani, can you please share again the link?
I certainly can. Give me 1 second. Okay, it should be more recently in the chat now. Can everyone see it?
Yes,
it's in the chat.
Okay, over to you. Elias, can you just confirm for me, please, that you can see the Jamboard, as in that's what I'm sharing now?
Yes, it is currently
Okay.
showing.
Okay.
Mhm.
And really, there's no right, there's no wrong answer here. You'll see it's very diverse. Obviously, it's going to be affected by what space in higher education you occupy and work in, but it's really just, you know, whatever comes to mind. What are examples of measures of student success? So we're getting some good responses here. Graduate attributes, and not simply just the attributes, but students' growth and development toward those attributes. Academic skills, student participation, a big one that's very prevalent at the moment, mental health and wellness. Students' learning experience or experiences, throughput rates, graduateness, preparation for graduation. Are students good and self-directed learners? Confidence, student confidence. Access and knowledge of support services. So honestly, this list could be endless, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Where it becomes a difficult thing is when we translate that into, and we start to think about, okay, so what does this mean for the kinds of data we collect? And ultimately the decisions that we need to make because of the data we are collecting, right? So depending on, you know, where you are, what department you're in, if you're an academic who's teaching, or if you're just working in the FYE space as a coordinator or as a practitioner, you know, what you value in terms of student success might be quite different to what somebody else values. And that's okay. But at some point, the university has to make decisions with regards to what are we going to collect data on, and how is that best going to help us on our journey to ensure that we support and ensure the success of all of our students. So also just remember, if you need to, there are pages 2 and 3 if you want to keep adding. And this is live, so if you think of other things as we go along and you want to add to it, please do. But what I want to do now, I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint or my presentation, if I can just, there we go. So what I'm actually going to do now is
Nee. Ja, nee, dit is so. Moenie 'n fout maak nie. Maar
we're getting interference from someone else. So what I want to do is I deliberately phrased this as our journeying towards, right? UCT is by no means yet at the point to say, you know, we're experts in collecting data and making informed decisions based on that data. It's very much a journey we are walking. And I often, for me, and this is my personal reflection, I often think of myself as a character, or put myself as a character in that, for many, beloved film, The Wizard of Oz. So I want to take you back in time to 1939. So 1939 is when the film adaptation of Fred Baum's 1900 book, The Wonderful World of Oz, was produced and made available to audiences by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. And for those of you who may know the film, you may starting to get a sense of where the first part of the title of my presentation is, shall we say, borrowed from. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. Very briefly, this is really like the cook's guide to what this film is, in case you're unfamiliar with it. Really what the film is about, it tells the story of Dorothy, played by Julie Garland, and her little dog Toto, who are swept away by a tornado that hits their farm in Kansas, and they land up in the land of Oz. And as they journey through the land of Oz, they meet interesting characters. They're hoping to get to the Emerald City to actually meet the Wizard of Oz. And on their journey to that destination, they meet the Tin Man, a scarecrow, and a lion. So why this particular analogy? So in the film, they're walking this journey to get towards the Emerald City, right? To meet the Wizard of Oz. And there's this, by now, for many people, famous interaction among Dorothy, the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, and the Lion. And as they're walking through a very dark forest, they start to hear noises coming from the foliage among the trees and such. And the Scarecrow starts to wonder if there are any animals out there, any animals that would say, eat straw, because obviously that's important for him. And the Tin Man replies, yes, there are probably lions and tigers and bears out there. And of course, now the Scarecrow starts to feel rather anxious, and he starts to repeat these lines. And Dorothy throws in afterwards, oh my, for dramatic effect. And hence one of the most famous lines of the movie is born, which is lions and tigers and bears, oh my. And so often I have this mantra running through my head when I'm working in the space of data-informed decision-making, but instead of lions and tigers and bears, I have data and analytics and, that should be decision-making, I beg your pardon. So it's data and analytics and decision-making, oh my. It's not always necessarily an oh my that follows afterwards. Sometimes there are some other words that enter there. But for the most part, the point is those three words, the lions and tigers and bears, oh my, very often in common parlance are exchanged for three other words, depending on whatever situation one is working in, to really try to convey a sense of awe or apprehension or fear, based on a combination of things that you happen to be working with. And so for many of us, I would argue, and certainly for myself working in various spaces at UCT, sometimes we are overwhelmed. We are, I don't necessarily want to say in awe of data. I mean, some of us could be, but sometimes we just get a little bit overwhelmed. If you think back to a moment ago when I was asking you to share about how, what are examples of measures of student success, it can be very overwhelming when you see all those different thoughts that you were sharing. And now you start to think, good grief, now, how do we actually start to measure that? And how do we measure that in ways that are helpful and beneficial to the academic project in ways that support student success? And so one of the central things that I'm finding on this journey towards data-informed decision-making, certainly in my own experience, is somewhat captured by a central theme in The Wizard of Oz. Central to their journey, to these 5 characters' journey, so Dorothy and her dog Toto, and the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Lion, central to their journey to the Emerald City and to find the Wizard of Oz is following the yellow brick road. Songs have been written about it. Elton John has one, for example. But there's the set path that they're following, right? It's marked, it's paved, hopefully relatively smooth. But certainly, I think for many of us, as we travel this journey in terms of data-informed decision-making, that's not true. The path isn't marked. There's no one singular path for all of us. And there are challenges that come down the pike and that come down the path. And so very often we are all ultimately journeying towards being able to make decisions based on evidence that's ultimately going to improve our experiences for our students, but the ways in which we get there and the ways in which we ultimately make those decisions are going to look quite different. And that's important. There is and can be no cookie cutter approach. There can be no one size fits all. And so every institution has to chart its own path in terms of its data that it collects, the analytics that it runs, and the decisions that they ultimately make based on what the data is telling them. So what I'd like us to do now, just as as we walk on this journey and we try to follow a little bit of what Dorothy and her medley mix are working towards, I'd like you to go back to the Jamboard, if you would. And on page 4 of the Jamboard, I've posed another question, and I can certainly share some of my own experiences, but I'd like to hear from some of you. What are some of the challenges that you have or are experiencing or have experienced on your own journey toward data-informed decision-making? So what are some of those challenges that you've encountered that have perhaps meant the path hasn't necessarily been, or the journey hasn't necessarily been a particularly easy one? So if you can go to page 4 of the Jamboard, we'll see up at the top, it says 1 of 7. So if we scroll along to page 4, what are some challenges at your institution for data-informed decision-making? And again, it's really whatever comes to mind. I mean, it could be from something small and granular to something that's much more systemic. I'm interested to hear. And if anybody wants to speak to what they've put up on the Jamboard, I'm happy for that as well. I'm watching the Jamboard, but certainly if anybody wants to say something as well, you're most welcome. The limitations introduced by demographics alone as a general measure of success. Absolutely. Messy data. Yes, very, very much so. Data integrity, different reports on different days. Is data being captured well? Some data is not being collected at all. Different data definitions, yes, and our own very brief collaborative thinking around student success is a good example of that. Is, how do you define student success, for example? Because depending on how you define student success, that will, by logic, determine what your measures are going to be. And then again, by logic, determines what data you should be collecting, right? Just in time to analyze the data, different understandings of the same data, yes. Meeting the audience in the way that they can relate to, absolutely. An audience can be plural as well, very broad, right? Are we talking to students? Are we talking to staff? Are we talking to parents? Are we talking to potential funders? Other stakeholders that are related to the spaces of higher education? Again, difference, very much difference, right? Different data, different decisions, different interpretations. I mean, you or I could interpret the same set of data very differently. Students not providing correct or right information. Making sure that people don't make data informed into data led. Yes. Dealing with preconceived notions and incidental experiences. If you need to, you can move on to page 5 and 6 as well. I've allowed 3 pages for contributions. Context. Yes, context is so important. Just among our institutions that are represented most likely in this webinar, our students are different, our staff are different, different priorities. Yeah, difference is a big underlying theme. Students do not complete surveys that can be used for data-driven decisions, especially if there's no incentive. I think that's particularly true at the moment. I don't know what it's like at your campus, but certainly among students and staff at UCT, there is just this real data fatigue, survey fatigue, call it what you'd like. There's just this real sense of, oh, not another survey, or oh, not another method to collect data, right? And I think people are just generally very tired of that, and perhaps rightly so. That I think a lot of people have also recognized that this COVID moment that we find ourselves in has also provided both a plethora of opportunities to collect data that we might not have collected before, but also to find out things about our students and about our staff that we had no need to know of before, for example, levels of access to internet connectivity at home, for example. And so all of that compounds many of the initiatives that have already been underway in terms of trying to collect data and better make decisions based on that evidence. Data silos and political lines. Yes, the devolved institution, certainly I can speak to my own case at UCT, is probably one of the biggest stumbling blocks and challenges for us in terms of moving along on this journey towards better decisions. I was trying to see if I've relevancy. Yes, certainly at the moment, we've had to pivot so quickly to alternative modes of teaching and alternative modes of engaging with our students. So data that we might have been collecting 2 years ago might not have relevancy at the moment, and yet a whole other suite of data is needed for us to best be kept abreast of what's going on with our students, and in terms of measures of best understanding levels of learning and levels of understanding that are happening in our classroom. So relevancy is absolutely a big one, as is capacity to deal with data. Capacity in terms of people, capacity in terms of infrastructure, capacity in terms of funding. There's multiple challenges that relate to that element of capacity for sure. Our scenarios and models depend on history, something we don't really have now. Yeah, again, at the moment, you know, sort of the teaching and learning space for many, or the academic project for many, feels like a bit of a moving target at the moment, because obviously we're having to be responsive to the needs of staff and students at our own institutions, but then also reading beyond that, one's got to be responsive to and honor what the national government regulations are in terms of COVID protocols and levels of lockdown. And that's very difficult for a university to move very quickly like that and make various changes. Yeah, some really great contributions here. I mean, this is it. This is what we are dealing with, you know, in terms of journeying together, both as our own institutions, but collectively as Siyaphumelela, for example. These are the challenges we are dealing with, and they are by no means insignificant. And it's certainly not a case of one institution has one challenge to deal with. Every institution has multiple, if not all of these challenges that we need to deal with. Yeah, somebody just wrote silos in very big letters, and that's true. Silos is not helpful to, in my opinion, any part of the academic project. It's lovely. Thank you for those contributions. So let me just go back to where I was. And again, please don't feel free, please don't think you have to stop contributing. Jamboard is obviously always available for you. So if you think of other things as we move through this presentation together or our time together, please do continue to add. That's perfectly fine. Let's just go back here. So I think one of the things we've truly established now is that there is no set yellow brick road for us. There is no set path. We're all going to get to where we ultimately want to be based on our own context and based on our own challenges that we have to meet along the way. So in terms of UCT's journey, because one of the things I do want to spend time on today is one of the points of my webinar is to share with you. So where are we? You know, where are we on this journey? And you know, UCT unfortunately was late to join the Siyaphumelela network. We joined in the second round of calls put out for partner institutions. So we joined in 2019. And I think we ultimately came to join Siyaphumelela because different people at UCT got involved with data and, you know, watching conversations that were happening nationally and globally around the need to use data more, use data better, and use data to inform decisions that are going to be made in the best interests of our students. And I know certainly at UCT and at other institutions across South Africa, Georgia State University was one that we looked to a lot and we consulted with a lot in terms of really trying to get our journey going. And so part of that was their strong encouragement as well of actually joining Siyaphumelela and learning from the good work that's already being done there, but also being able to contribute. And so that speaks to my second point there. I think, perhaps there was a reluctance across the institution to recognize the power of or the need for data, to be able to collect it, to interrogate it, to utilize it. And then again, as I said, new people come into different spaces and sort of the tide changes. So UCT is now part of the Siyaphumelela initiative. And now having said that, and as many of you alluded to in the challenges that you shared with us a moment ago, COVID sort of propelled us or thrust us very quickly, should I say, into needing to hurry ourselves along the journey of actually using data and breaking down some of those silos, addressing some of those challenges, and really trying to make a go of actually using data to better inform our decisions. And so one of the things that's happened is UCT now has something called DASC, which is the Data Analysis for Student Success Committee. Quite importantly for UCT, I would argue, is that it's now actually a subcommittee. It's a recognized subcommittee of the Senate Teaching and Learning Committee. So we as a subcommittee are answerable to the Senate Teaching and Learning Committee, which is then obviously accountable to council. And the actual date of approval of this particular committee, even though it had started its work before this, was early this year, the 5th of February 2021. And so we've really seen a ramping up of the work of DASC in terms of what's needing to be done, meetings that are taking place, conversations that are happening, and collaborations that we're seeing. I would argue in large part for two reasons. One, because of COVID and because of the rapid pivot to online teaching and learning and everything that that means for the academic project. But also if you take a look at the composition of this committee, dare I say this is sort of like a bit groundbreaking for UCT. We've tried very hard to break some of those barriers, to break down some of those silos. And so you can see there's a wide range of spaces at UCT that are represented on this particular committee. So we have our Deputy Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning, who chairs the committee. We have the Dean of the Center for Higher Education Development, Ched, who sits on the committee. And then you can see there's Deputy Deans responsible for teaching and learning, our Siyaphumelela project leader. We have people from the Center for Innovation in Learning and Teaching. So that's basically like our Center for Teaching and Learning. Our director from the Academic Development Program, ADP, or Extended Degree Programs that sit within Ched. Student representation, which has been very important for us and has been built in right from the start. IPD, Institutional Planning Department, they have a seat at the table. And then you can see there's Student Affairs, ICTS, myself, I sit on the committee as, in my capacity as Director of the First Year Experience. And so it's been quite groundbreaking, I would say, in terms of the level of representation, both the positions held, we're like a director of, or executive director or deputy dean, but also just the spaces across campus, including all the faculties that we see represented on this particular committee. So it's been a really good step forward for us, much needed for a long time. But what we now find ourselves working on in spaces is, I would argue that maybe 3.5 years ago, something like this kind of diagram was not something that was very common in terms of the work we're doing at my institution. So now, as I said, DASC started its work before it was formally approved in February this year. And one of the things that we set out very early to do was actually to think of data analytics and decision-making based on that data from a systems approach. Some people, myself, I tend to think of it more from like a backwards design perspective. In other words, what is our ultimate goal? And then how do we work backwards from there to actually get ourselves to, for example, promoting and supporting student success, if that's the goal we're working towards. So we've spent quite a lot of time, and this is also by no means necessarily something that is static. You know, it's a living document. It's something we revisit periodically, but it's really trying to understand how can we get to a point that we can make systemic interventions, that very last block at the bottom, something that's being developed. If you look at the key or the legend up at the top, it'll tell you where things are at, if these actually exist, are they being developed, are they not yet in existence. But our ultimate goal is to get to the level of data-informed systemic interventions or systemic changes that are ultimately going to best support the success of each and every one of our students at UCT. So some of the things that feature in this systems diagram, if you will, student performance data, which many of you shared as a measure of student success. We need to be able to have some kind of predictive model based on that, but also based on an early warning system or early assessment. I beg your pardon, I couldn't get the word assessment. Early cluing in for students and for staff how well students are or are not doing. Some of that is obviously going to be pulled from course data, or a lot of that gets pulled from course data. In that regard, we've spent a lot of time actually trying to understand what we call SIGs, or courses that impede graduation, trying to really drill down and see what are the barriers, what are the stumbling blocks in these courses that see students fail repeatedly and ultimately impede their ability to successfully graduate. So there's been quite a lot of work done on our SIGs. Student engagement data, we're actually pulling a lot of that at the moment from VULA, which is a management system, obviously because a lot of teaching and learning is happening either in hybrid format or online. So there's a lot of, for better or for worse, student engagement data that we can plug into. Something that does not yet exist, but something which we recognize there's a need for, is a case management system, actually having a system that we can use to really comprehensively track students on a case-by-case basis to see how students are doing, to pick up trends, to pick up patterns, and ultimately feed into advising interventions. Advising is an aspect of this system where quite a lot of work at UCT is already being done, and I'll share that with you on the next slide. But as you can see, I mean, there's a lot that has to be thought of from a large scale or from a large scale systems perspective. And then there has to be difference built into that. As we've pointed out, there are data interfaces for different use cases. So, different needs, different measures of support, different measures of student success. We're going to have to collect that data differently. We have to analyze data differently, depending on what it is we're looking at, and ultimately what we think we need to make decisions based on. But really the underlying goal here is, what are those systemic in the institution changes that we can make that are ultimately going to benefit our students and best support and promote their success. As I said, this is very much a living document, a living desk document, but this is some of our progress on the system to date. You can see here that, for example, if we look at our early warning system, it's by no means something that exists across the university yet, but we have a pilot system running in our science faculty where we're trying to learn as much as we can in terms of what does a good and effective early warning system look like, in terms of when early assessment exams and tests and such are actually written, how the feedback is given to students, and importantly, how is feedback given to staff too, because it's a good barometer for how a course is going and not necessarily just how much students are learning. Comparing that, for example, with a case management tool that's currently being studied and piloted in commerce. So we've got something running in science, we've got another pilot running in commerce. And then if we look, for example, in our academic advising interactions, this is something that does have a slightly bigger reach across the university, because it's running out of CHED, the faculty I'm in, the Center for Higher Education Development, which can have a broader, more global reach across the university. But the point I want to make about this particular diagram, and in terms of the progress on the system, for us, it's a journey we're on where we're trying different things in different faculties. And I don't know what it's like at your own institutions, but certainly for us, one of the lessons we've been learning as we walk this journey is different faculties are going to be open to different things. And so you'll reach out to faculties, for example, in other words, it's no accident that there happens to be a pilot for an early warning system running in science. It's something they've desperately wanted. It's something that they need, and they've wanted assistance with how to actually get a good, valid, authentic system up and running. We don't necessarily have the same kind of buy-in or the same kind of need in humanities. Ultimately, it's something we want to have institution-wide, but we've had to sort of measure ourselves and go where the need is and where people are willing to work with us to be able to then run a pilot, evaluate it, assess it, collect data on the data, if you will, and then make the case to other faculties to show that this is working well in science, and it could work well, for example, in law with some modifications and some changes. A lot of this work is being driven by many of those people that are listed in terms of portfolio on the DAS committee, but then with other individuals being drawn in from the particular faculty we happen to be working with, or the particular unit that we happen to be working with. And of course, a lot of this information by virtue of this webinar, for example, but also other Siyaphumelela spaces, it's a two-way flow of information. You know, we're feeding information back to Siyaphumelela as much as Siyaphumelela is trying to help us by virtue of data coaches and the like, in terms of actually, you know, upskilling ourselves, I should say, or bringing us up to speed in terms of how we best can use data for our decision making. So this is very much, very much a work in progress. And some of this work has been spurred on quite nicely and quite quickly because of the work, I beg your pardon, because of what's happening with COVID. And I'd certainly say our academic advising initiatives and academic advising project has seen quite an impetus. And so in that respect, while COVID has taken a lot from many people, it has also provided quite a lot of opportunity, which certainly for us in our space has been quite helpful. One of the things that I wanted to make available today in terms of the resources that we are making available through this week-long series of webinars is, what are some of the important questions that I've certainly been asking and others at UCT have been asking, and that perhaps you've been asking along the way too? Because again, this journey is, you know, there's no one model for everyone. And everyone's going to have their own challenges that they need to deal with along the way. But there are some, in my estimation, some really key questions we need to keep in mind. The first of which is, and I've alluded to this already through mentioning backward design, you know, what's our ultimate goal? Every institution can go forth and say, yes, we want to use data, we want to make decisions based on our data, but for what purpose? For us at UCT, sort of our wig from Siyaphumelela that they encourage us to think of, which is our wildly important goal, is to use meaningful data and visualizations to improve student performance and success over time. So that's ultimately our goal. Now, there's a lot there we can unpack. I don't have the time to unpack that with you today, but that's what we're working towards. That's our barometer. That's our litmus test, right? And then you've got to start to break that down and say, okay, well, then what is our definition of student success? And that takes us back to the Jamboard that we started off with today. When I asked you what are measures of student success, I mean, you can just see by the 25, 26, 30 post-it notes that are there. There's no repetition. There could easily be 60 measures of student success. So what are we going to pick? And more importantly, why? And does that ultimately speak to how we as an institution are defining student success? What resources are going to be invested and made available to make sure we do this right and we do it well? And we've talked a little bit about this today. Resources is not just money, but it's people, it's infrastructure, it's people's time. It's the technology that we need. If we're going to do it, we have to do it well. There really isn't the time or the space to make mistakes here. We have to do it well. And what resourcing is going to be put behind this to make sure we can deliver on that? We've spoken about this already, but certainly in our case, if we know what our guiding definition of student success is, then the next thing we need to ask ourselves is, so what are our measures going to be? We as an institution don't have the capacity to constantly be measuring 60 indicators, for example, of student success. So we've got to be very discerning. We've got to decide what's best going to suit our purposes. Another important question is who, in terms of individuals, officers, units, programs, who at the institution needs to be involved in this process and when and for what purpose. And of course that changes. You know, the people who, for example, are involved in the science faculty pilot system on early warning system might not be the same individuals who are involved in the commerce pilot of the case management system, for example, and that's okay, but there does have to at some point be some synergy and some, you know, we're all traveling towards this ultimate destination. Somebody mentioned this in one of the challenges, but an important question to ask ourselves is who are we presenting this data to and why? You know, if we're doing all this work, if we're ultimately collecting data and we're trying to make decisions based on it to improve our student experience, who are we presenting this to? And depending on who you're presenting to, you're probably going to have to present the data in different ways to ensure that you're speaking and speaking well to your audience. Why are we doing this? I think for many institutions, the question has been for quite a while, why are we doing this? And I think if one of the things COVID has taught us is because we're in an environment at the moment where things change very rapidly, we're doing this because we actually need to know our students better. We need to collect better data on our students. We need to collect better data on their learning such that we can ultimately use that data full circle to improve their student experience. And then perhaps for me, the most important question that I always hold front and center is, because I've seen some aspects of our journey come a cropper because of this, is are we willing, we have to ask ourselves very earnestly and honestly, are we willing as individuals and as an institution, are we willing to make the changes that the data is suggesting needs to be made, right? It's no use collecting all this data, analyzing the data, running various analytics and making decisions if ultimately we don't make the change that that data is suggesting we need to make. And that can be at multiple scales, you know, very granular, course-related scales right through to systemic changes at the institution. So for me, that's really been quite eye-opening. That's been quite a learning curve. And it's definitely something we need to hold ourselves accountable to, is are we willing to make those changes? And a change doesn't always mean bringing something new on board. A change can also mean we stop doing something based on what the data is telling us. So in conclusion, I want to come back to our set of characters here. We've got Dorothy, we've got the Scarecrow, we've got the Tin Man, and we've got the Lion. Why were they traveling to the Wizard of Oz? Why did they want to see the Wizard of Oz? Well, Dorothy was traveling there because she wanted to ultimately get home to her aunt and uncle in Kansas. The Scarecrow was traveling there because he wants a brain. He feels he doesn't have a brain. The Tin Man's traveling there because he wants a heart. Right? And the Lion is traveling to meet the wizard because he wants courage. So by way of bringing this all full circle and closing out the theme and the journey as the Wizard of Oz, I want to say a brain, the Scarecrow wanting a brain stands for knowledge, right? For thought processes. The Tin Man wanting a heart is, how does one say this? Determination, compassion in some respects, compassion and determination. And the Lion wanting courage is bravery. And I'm very much of the opinion that all three, thought processes, determination, and certainly courage and bravery, are absolutely needed as we travel this journey, because for many of the reasons we've said, there are boundless challenges that come down the path. But if we are willing to take on that challenge, and if we're willing to hold ourselves accountable to that question that I said, which is, are we willing to make the changes based on what the data is telling us? I absolutely believe that data, analytics, and decisions can ultimately lead to a much, much, much better student experience for students themselves, but also for staff at institutions. So I will leave it there. I'm more than happy to take questions and engage in some collective thinking and conversation with all of you now. I also do just want to point out below this image on the last slide is my email address. You are most welcome to email me at any point if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to correspond that way. But otherwise, I do want to thank you all very much for being here. And like I said, I'm happy to take questions if anyone does have any. Thanks, Ephraim.
Thanks very much, Danny, for that wonderful presentation. Let's invite comments and questions. Any comments? Just
so I'm just looking. I'm looking here at the chat quickly.
Yeah.
Let me just go. How did you draw data for face-to-face components of courses with hybrid teaching and learning models? The component of face-to-face, does it not get left out, especially when measuring engagement, but also for advising interventions? Are you asking specifically now because of the kinds of data we're collecting from our learning management system? Sorry, I'm just trying to understand the question a bit better so that I can answer you authentically.
Yes, Nchi, you can explain your question.
Okay, sorry, Danny, and thank you so much for a very informative talk. I don't know if I'm audible enough.
Yes, I can hear you well.
Okay, yeah, so I actually just started my PhD in this field. That's why I just run around everywhere seeing what people do. And you're very right, because based on what I've done so far is I've explored and seen a plethora of focuses based on institutions. As you've already explained that there's context involved, but based on where I am right now, I see the focus. I've identified a bit of gaps when I was working as a researcher in some division, but now my problem is, how then do you define success, right? And in defining success, I'm asking myself, how am I going to measure post the definition of what I see as success? So now I'm thinking, you know, we move into level 1 and hopefully there'll be a bit more face-to-face interactions that happens, especially if I'm going to look at, I'm mainly concerned with engagement. I think it's a very important component as the work of Professor George Kuhn has declared in high impact practices and student engagement. But now my question is, how am I going to measure that, especially with the more face-to-face component, because I feel like I will not do it justice in terms of the kind of information that I can collect from engagement or student, unless if I run like surveys and do more personalized interviews with the students and the lecturers.
So I don't think there's sort of like the magic answer here, right? Because there's many components to your answer. So let me just go back to for a moment, talking about when I said that there's a lot of, I'm going to put it in quotes this time, student engagement data that we can glean from VULA, or whatever your learning management system happens to be. Those are imperfect measures, right? Because that data can tell me, for example, if I've got a class of 60 students, that data can tell me that, let's say today, 31 of those students actually logged on to the course site. But it doesn't necessarily tell me what they were doing on that course site. Did they download? I can tell if they downloaded readings, but I can't tell if they've actually done the reading, right? So is that actually a measure of engagement, right?
Not really, no.
So we say we can glean measures of engagement, but it's a flawed set of data, right? Because you can unless you're actually walking with a student for 24 hours to see what they do over the course of their time at university, I don't think we ever get a true representation of what that engagement entails and what it looks like, right? Because that's very different for every student. So, you know, in as much as we say now under COVID, because teaching has reverted to online, that we can collect a whole lot more student engagement data, I do think we need to be careful how we say that, because it's not necessarily a very good indicator of student engagement. You see what I'm saying? You know, so for me, knowing that a student has logged onto my course site for today is helpful to know, but unless, you know, there's all kinds of data tracking set up, it's not necessarily going to tell me, did the student download and do a reading? I could tell they've downloaded the reading, but I don't know that they've actually done the reading, you know? Am I making sense?
You're making a lot of sense. I'm thinking to myself, then what could be the most convenient and easily accessible way to try and measure engagement, maybe on their final year or when they're doing the internships or they've graduated, and just see where they are.
Yeah.
And, okay.
You know, I think that's a really good question. And I think, you know, if there was no limitations, if there were no challenges, I think that, you know, the best answer would be actually to have students narrate their day, like literally continuously for, I don't know, let's say a period, 24 hours. Like you give them a voice recorder and you ask them to, you know, keep telling you what are they doing and when are they doing it. But I mean, that's insane. You cannot do that for every single student. But if you really want an in-depth understanding and holistic picture, you know, that's the kind of thing that would have to happen. But we don't do that because financially, resourcefully, it's just not possible. So we use the best indicators, if you will, that could help us try to get a better understanding of that.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Ku asks, are you using a particular case management software? At the moment, Ku, no. The best example we have to draw on at the moment, I don't know if other institutions in the room are familiar with this, is the case management dashboard that is used by the ICUSASA Student Financial Aid Program, or ISFAP. They have quite a good, also constantly being developed case management tracking system for ISFAP students. And so as we learn more about that and as they build that system out more, it's something that ideally we would like to be able to emulate in our own case management system writ large across the institution. But currently, there is no system-wide case management software that's being used. What is the commerce case study focusing on? And please tell us more about it. I can certainly find out for you. I'm not actually myself involved with the commerce case study. I can check in with my colleagues who are, but I know it is about actually trying to come up with a well-designed set of parameters that a case management system for our institution would need to take into consideration. But more than that, I don't actually know because I'm not involved with that project myself. But I can certainly get information and get that back to you.
Okay.
I'm just trying to scroll down here.
There's Samuel as well. He's
Samuel
asking
asked,
about the quality
how
assurance.
quality assure data. It's criteria to validate the quality of data. Good question, Samuel. I mean, a lot of that ultimately comes back to what I said for me, which is a very grounding thing, is, you know, what is the ultimate goal? You know, if the ultimate goal is to measure student success through graduation, through throughput and graduation, that kind of data in terms of quality assurance is something that has to be done institution-wide. And typically in our case, that's through IPD, institutional planning departments. And so they've got their checks and balances in place to quality assure that kind of data. But if you're looking at student success, perhaps not from, you know, throughput and graduation rates, but maybe at a course level to try to understand how students have improved. An example I like to give is, you know, for me, a measure of student success, if I'm teaching a writing intensive course, for example, for me, a very good indicator of student success is, can students who came into my course at the beginning very unsure of themselves and actually not able to write very well, are they graduating from my course so much better able to do so? Can they actually write well? Can they engage in critical thinking and so on and so forth? And so then your question becomes something very, very important, because what kind of data are you going to collect in that regard, and how are you going to ensure the quality of that data? And so then that's when, you know, being able to call on colleagues across the institution who are working towards a common goal of student success to be able to, you know, talk through ideas, bounce ideas off each other, and get a sense of how do you actually ensure the reliability and the validity of our data at multiple scales. That's when initiatives like this, for example, Siyaphumelela, becomes so important, because there's so much to be learned from other institutions as well. And depending on what scale you're looking at in terms of moving towards better supporting student success, there's a tremendous amount that we can learn from each other. So I think it depends on what scale you're talking about. I think it depends on, what your measure of success is. And I think it depends on who you talk to, how people collectively decide they're going to ensure quality of data. And then, of course, you layer onto that one final thing as well. Again, I don't know how it works at each of your institutions, but we've got very vigorous data ethics processes we have to run through to get clearance for, including any kind of data the institution collects on students for decision-making purposes. So that's, each faculty and the institution has an ethics clearance committee. I hope that answered your question somewhat, Samuel. Any other final questions?
Any other questions?
Otherwise, Ephraim, I'll leave it to you to close.
Thank you very much, Dani. I don't seem to see any more questions. I don't see any hands up. I think you have exhausted all of them.
Yeah,
Thanks very much.
No, that's
That
my
was
pleasure. My pleasure.
That
Lovely
was wonderful.
to be with all of you. Thank you, Ephraim. It's lovely to be with all of you.
Thanks very much. And thank you to all people who managed to attend this particular webinar and several others that have happened over the week. This brings us to the end of the series for our first year experience webinars for this week. And in fact, for this year, 2021. We will be posting information on the website regarding more activities that will happen early 2022. I'd just like to request you to please respond to the webinar evaluation instrument. I've put the link in the chat space. And if you can be able to do so as soon as possible, would like to get a sense of what people think about the webinars that we have run this week. And on the basis of your feedback, we will be able to plan more useful and more fruitful activities for 2022. So please do respond to the evaluation survey. We will also send the same link to your email addresses. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of the year.